Hi, and welcome back for your next chapter for the cognitive psychology course. We're going to do some cognitive neuroscience here. There's a couple of things we need to do, uh, and partly this section will be something of a review of basic physiological psychology that you would encounter in the introductory psychology course, or if you've had the PSB 3002 course, then this would be a lot, of a kind of review for you. But we just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So that means we're going to talk a little bit about brains and neurons and things like that. We're also going to talk later, kind of at the second half of the a set of notes here about kind of methodologies for studying brain activity during cognitive tasks. That's something that I mentioned very briefly in the first chapter video. Um, but we're also going to talk about something else, which is how brains can compute and how we might imagine neurons as functioning like maybe switches in a computer processor. And that's going to set us up to maybe talk a little bit about neural networks and artificial neural networks and AI a little bit as well here. But first things first, we're going to start with the nervous system. So you should hopefully know the basics here, right? You know that the nervous system is divided into the central and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is defined here as the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is kind of everything else. Um, just as a, I'm just reminding myself I was on the next slide there. Um, just as a reminder, and we're not really going to need to break it down into all of this level of detail, but the peripheral nervous system is further composed into different kinds of functional systems. And from my personal kind of way of thinking about it, I like thinking of it in terms of the functional systems as opposed to just an anatomical breakdown of central versus peripheral. So by that, what I mean is in the peripheral nervous system, we have the autonomic system, which is regulating a lot of basic life functions. And so it's subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And then we also have the somatic nervous system, which is the sensory and the motor systems. And all of those are relevant in various ways to cognition. But what we're going to see is that by and large, with cognitive neuroscience, there's a heavy focus on what's happening primarily in the brain and in the cortex, especially. So we're going to spend some time there. But we also need to talk about neurons here. So here we have a fairly standard kind of diagram schematic of a couple of neurons and a synapse. So if you, again, you should remember the basics here of your basic neuron anatomy. You have the cell body, and then you have all these branches called dendrites coming off of one part of the cell body. And we usually think of the dendrites as this place where neurons receive incoming signals from other neurons. But then, of course, one branch off of the cell body is the axon. And you can see the axon here with the myelin sheath, these segments, these fatty segments covering the axon, and that arrow indicating that an action potential or a nerve impulse is traveling down the length of the axon. And you see then these branches of the axon called the axon terminals. Those branch out, and the little buttons there at the end, called axon terminal buttons, are now coming into contact with receptors on the dendrites. These are called dendritic spines, and each dendritic spine contains lots of little chemical receptors. And so the axon terminal releases, we see the vesicles of neurotransmitter here on the right, these little bubbles in the synaptic button that contain the little red molecules of neurotransmitter. And then the neurotransmitter is dumped into the synapse or synaptic cleft, where it can then activate receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. These receptors essentially work like locks, really. And so the idea here is that each neurotransmitter, and there are many different kinds of neurotransmitters. And again, we don't really need to go into that rabbit hole, but there's dopamine and serotonin and epinephrine and GABA and glutamate and acetylcholine and on and on. And these all have different molecular shapes. The receptor sites are sort of like a lock, and the molecule of the neurotransmitter is a key. And the idea is, of course, is that a key has to fit the lock. It has to have the right shape in order to unlock it. And so some receptors can only be unlocked by dopamine, other receptors can only be unlocked by serotonin, and so on and so forth. And when the neurotransmitter is present, that unlocks these receptors, which then triggers sodium channels, voltage-gated sodium channels to open. That lets sodium into the neuron. That's going to raise the internal voltage. And if we cross the firing threshold of that neuron, then we will see an action potential that spikes at the base of the axon hillock. And again, it's going to travel down the length of the axon and stimulate some other neuron further down the chain. I'm mentioning this issue of the firing threshold because that's going to be relevant coming up here. So the idea is that when you have a weak signal coming in, and what's a weak signal? A weak signal means maybe a few of these ion channels open up, and a few molecules of sodium are allowed to enter into the neuron. Remember, neurons have a resting potential that's usually in the ballpark of negative 70 millivolts. And so if we let some sodium ions into the neuron, sodium has a positive charge. So that's going to raise the internal voltage above negative 70, moving it closer towards zero and then into the positive. But just a few of those sodium ions entering into the neuron causes what's called an EPSP, or excitatory postsynaptic potential, that might just be a small blip. And then it might not do anything, and it just settles back down into the resting state of negative 70 millivolts. But if we cross the firing threshold of the neuron, this triggers a chain reaction of even more sodium channels opening, which lets a huge influx of sodium into the neuron, and that's going to cause a massive spiking of the voltage going way into the positive at this point. So we want to know that because when we talk about these neural networks, we want to understand the concept of this activation function for a neuron. So here's what we know about neurons. We have the idea of communication happening via the synapse, right? So we're receiving a signal coming from another neuron at the dendrites. That if that signal is strong enough, the action potential occurs at the axon hillock, signal transmits down the axon, and again, through another synapse, we send that signal further on. A key component of activity, especially in the cortex, maybe less so in the peripheral nervous system, is that synapses can change over time, and that's the concept of neuroplasticity. How would a synapse change over time? Well, a lot of it has to do with those receptors that I was talking about. These receptors can grow, right? So there can be metabolic changes inside the postsynaptic cell that causes the dendrites themselves to grow, right? So a few extra dendritic branches, but on top of those dendrites, right, were those dendritic spines. And of course, we can grow more dendritic spines, and each of the dendritic spines has lots of different little receptor sites, and we can grow more of those too. We can also reduce their population. So instead of increasing the total number of receptors on the postsynaptic cell, which will increase its sensitivity to a signal, we can also decrease the total number of receptors, which will decrease its sensitivity. This is sometimes called upregulation and downregulation, respectively, right? So we can upregulate a system, making it more sensitive to signaling, and we can downregulate it and make it less sensitive to the signaling. But there are other things, right? The presynaptic neuron can manufacture more neurotransmitter. It can manufacture less neurotransmitter. Of course, the axon can grow a few extra branches as well. So again, all of these things will influence the level of connectivity between the pre and postsynaptic neurons. It's worth mentioning a few different other kinds of neurons here. So there are some neurons, we'll call them sensory neurons, that are specialized because they respond not to, typically not from an action potential at a synapse, but they have some kind of mechanism built into them that causes them to react to some sort of stimulus energy from the environment. The rods and cones, the photoreceptors in the eye, do have chemicals inside of them that undergo a breakdown in the presence of light that changes the internal voltage of the rods and cones, which will then trigger an action potential that's transmitted down their axons to other neurons. The hair cells in the ear respond to vibrations of the sound waves that pull on cilia that are attached to those cells. And again, that triggers an action potential in those neurons. Taste buds respond to chemical energies that activates these receptors in a way that's a whole lot like how a neurotransmitter unlocks a receptor on a dendrite. But in this case, now it's a chemical in some food that we have eaten that will unlock the receptors on the taste buds that will then activate those action potentials. Within the nervous system, especially in the brain and in the cortex, the neurons what did be considered interneurons, meaning they receive information from other neurons and then they transmit information to other neurons. So they just have dendrites and axons. They don't have any specialized sensory receptors or anything like that. The motor neurons are distinct because even though they do have dendrites that receives a signal coming from other neurons, just like an interneuron does, their axons do not typically synapse onto other neurons. Their axons will synapse directly onto muscle fibers. And so when the neurotransmitter is released at what's called the neuromuscular junction, that neurotransmitter then triggers muscle contraction. So it's important to realize here how the muscle fibers themselves are directly connected to the nervous system. Okay, so let's talk about neural computing and try to think about how neurons might be able to compute and process information. And this takes us back again to the mid-20th century, into that era that I had mentioned in the first chapter about the emergence of information processing concepts and computer science. And it begins with McCulloch and Pitts and their concept of an artificial neural network here. So again, inspired by the concept of a Turing machine as a computing machine, we're going to try to imagine how we might think of neurons, right? So here the idea is that neuroscience had just started to discover how brains work, right? That there are neurons and that there are synapses and neurons have firing thresholds and different kinds of maybe weaker and strong inputs, right? So like I mentioned previously, the idea is you can have a stronger input that activates the cell. You can have a weak input that's not enough to activate the cell past its firing threshold. So we can have weighted input, right? And then also there's a binary input and output in the sense that neurons kind of work on this all or none principle. When a neuron fires its action potential, the action potential is considered an all or none response. And what that means is that the voltage spike that you see is always the same voltage response. We don't see weak voltages and voltage spikes and then stronger voltage spikes. We usually see the exact same change from -70 up to some positive number in the ballpark of +40 millivolts and then back down into the negative again as we enter into the refractory period and the neuron resets and can fire this again. So let's imagine a situation here where we're going to have a neuron. And this neuron, we'll call it Y, but it has an activation threshold that's set to this value called Y. And it's receiving two inputs from two other neurons, X1 and X2. And X1 and X2 might be able to give us different levels of excitation onto that postsynaptic cell Y. So here we have a couple of diagrams. So let's assume our threshold is 2. What does that mean? These are just made up numbers, but the idea is that can be any particular voltage setting inside of a cell, but we're going to call it 2 for the sake of ease of the math here, right? So what happens if the presynaptic neuron X1 sends a signal of strength 1 to the postsynaptic cell? Well, that signal of strength 1 is less than the threshold of 2. So the cell Y will not respond when that X1 signal arrives, right? But on the other hand, if we have a second cell X2 and it also sends a signal of strength 1, then again, of course, X2 by itself will not activate Y. But if X1 and X2 are active at the same time, and they simultaneously send a signal to Y, then we get to add their inputs together. And this is called, in this case, this is called spatial summation. What's happening here is that two different neurons from two different locations in the nervous system, therefore two different spaces, that's why it's called spatial summation, are converging onto the same postsynaptic cell, and their combined activation strength, 1 + 1, is now enough to activate the postsynaptic cell. So what we would say here is that the activity of Y is actually information. What is it information about? Well, if Y is not active, we don't know much, right? But if Y is active, that is, if Y is actually firing an action potential, that is information that it has received input from X1 and X2. And that and is the critical phrase here, right? Because Y is only active if X1 and X2 are both active at the same time. And that's why this is called an and function. Y is now telling us that X1 and X2 are true. And this is how we want to think about this now. We want to think about true and false statements here. So if Y is true, which means it's firing an action potential, that means X1 is true and X2 is true. So down here in text at the bottom, I have kind of created a regular natural language version of a decision-making function that requires an and. So let's say you're in the position of applying for jobs, and you are getting job offers. Hopefully you get lots of good job offers coming in. And what you want is you want a good salary, but you also want a good location. And so then the idea is that if both of those things are true, salary is good, location is good, then obviously you're going to say yes, because you have good salary and good location. So in that situation, because X1 is true, salary, and X2 is true, location, then Y is true. You accept, right? If it's only just one but not the other, you're going to say no, right? You're holding out for both. And so this idea that we make these kinds of decisions at a high level is obvious, I think, right? But the fact that we can design essentially like a circuit diagram here to show that neurons can make these kinds of decisions as well, which then hopefully lets us see how we might imagine how this kind of computational decision-making process works at a neural level, not just at a psychological or a linguistic level, right? On the right, we have the OR function. So now what's going to happen is that now we're going to imagine that the strength of the input to Y from X1 or X2 are both 2, right? So now the signal is a little stronger. And like I said before, maybe we can increase the strength of the signal through more neurotransmitter coming from X1 and X2, or maybe Y has increased its receptor density a little bit. So it's more sensitive to that signal that's coming in. And so either way, we have a stronger signal coming into Y. So now Y will respond if X1 is true, and it doesn't even matter if X2 is not true. But conversely, Y will respond if X2 is true, even if X1 is not true. And of course, Y will also respond if X1 and X2 are true, right? Obviously, you can add 2 + 2, and that's still greater than it's 4, so it's greater than the firing threshold. So now the activity of Y is information really now about an or decision, right? So if we change our logic a little bit here and say, I'm willing to accept the job if the salary is good or if the location is good, but I don't necessarily need to have both, then we get this kind of decision rule, right? Now we can go a little bit further. This is just a little bit more complex. I have changed the X2 weighting to be -1 now. What does the -1 mean here? So -1 means inhibition. And I didn't mention this earlier, but we've talked about excitation, right? And I mentioned the EPSP, the excitatory postsynaptic potential, where we send a signal that starts to raise the internal voltage of the postsynaptic cell up above that -70, getting closer to its firing threshold. But what if we send a signal that took the voltage of the cell down below -70, which is actually taking it further away from its firing threshold. And that's what inhibition does. And that's called an IPSP, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So what happens now is that if X1 is true, that could be enough to activate our neuron Y because its firing threshold is still 2. But what's critical here is that X2 must be false, right? So what does that mean? If X2 is false, the signal going from X2 to Y is 0, right? There's nothing happening there. And so we just get the 2 from X1. Y responds because X1 is true and X2 is false. But what if they're both true, right? So if X1 is true, it sends a signal of strength 2 to Y. But if X2 is true, then it sends a signal of -1, which reduces the 2, right? So we're going to have to add these two together. 2 plus -1 is just 1. It's 2 minus 1, right? And now Y will respond false. It is not active. So this kind of what's called an and not function, we can express this in language as well. So let's just say that uh, salary X1 is a critical factor for my decision making here, and location is important, but maybe maybe it's not critical anyway, but maybe there are some locations that I just find completely undesirable. Like maybe there's just, for some reason or another, I don't want to live in this one place, right? And so I'll accept a job offer in any other place as long as the salary is okay. But if it's in this one place, that's when X2 becomes true. If it's in this one undesirable location, then X2 becomes true. Right? Bad location is true. And then we reject, right? So as long as X1 is true and X2 is not true, and that's why it's called an and not function, Y returns a true value. Hope that makes sense. This is just a converse way of doing it. We can say that the idea is that location is more important, but maybe we have to factor in the cost of living. So we're going to say X1 is now the location. And so when the location is desirable, that's going to give us a 2. But if the salary is below the cost of living cutoff, then that X2 becomes true, and then we have to reject the offer. All right, so it's just a different way of conceptualizing the and not decision. Now we're going to make it a bit more complicated. Now, before I do this for a second, let's run it back here for a second. Here we have these diagrams that are just circles with X's and Y's on them and these arrows connecting them, right? And I kind of assumed that what we're talking about are neurons, right? And so X1 and X2 are neurons, and the arrows are essentially their axons connecting to Y. And we can think of it like this. But what we really have is what we might call a neural network, because it's a networked connection of neurons all communicating with each other. And so this is what we have here, is a neural network that instead of having 2 layers, as we saw before, now this has 3 layers. And so we're going to call X's the input layer. We're going to call Y on the far right-hand side the output layer, but in between is called a hidden layer. And these are the Z's here. So if you see this, one thing that you might notice is that this ought to look familiar, because let's imagine, just look at the Z's converging onto Y. They each have a signal strength of 2, and Y's threshold is still 2. So what is that? That's an OR function, right? Y will respond if Z1 is true, and Y will respond if Z2 is true, or both, but it doesn't matter, right? But feeding into Z are 2 different and not rules. So X1 is sending that signal of strength 2 to Z1, but -1 to Z2. And then, of course, the converse is happening from X2. So what's happening with Z1? Z1 will return a true if X1 is true, but not X2, right? Z2 will return a true statement or true value if X2 is true, but not X1. And now, if either one of Z1 or Z2 is true, Y is true. Let's work out the logic here. I have it at the bottom. Let's say you're offered dessert. And this is a weird scenario, right? But if someone says you can have cake or pie, You would say, okay, I'll take the cake or I'll take the pie. But if they say, no, you have to have both cake and pie, you're like, no, I don't want both, right? I just want one or the other, right? That's what this is. Let's imagine now, X1 is cake, X2 is pie. So if you are told that you can have cake, X1 is true, and you're not going to have pie, so X2 is false. So when this happens, X1 sends its signal strength 2 to Z1. X2 does nothing because it's false, right? So it's not active, so it's not sending in any inhibition to Z1. Meanwhile, because X1 is true, it's also sending inhibition to Z2, but ultimately that doesn't matter because Z1 becomes active, and that's going to activate Y. And you're going to say, yeah, I'll have the cake. Now, on the flip side, if you're offered pie but not cake, now X2 is the one that's sending its strength signal 2 to Z2. It inhibits Z1, but again, that's okay. X1's not active, so it's not doing anything. Z2 becomes active, and Y is true, and you're going to say, yes, I'll take the pie. But in this weird, odd scenario that I've come up with where you're forced to have both cake and pie, and you're going to say, no, right? Now we can account for that here because what's going to happen is that with cake being true, we're sending excitation to Z1 and we're sending inhibition to Z2. And with pi being true at X2, we're sending excitation to Z2 and inhibition to Z1. So now that X1 and X2 are both true, Z1 and Z2 are now false, right? They are not active, and neither one of them is active. Um, and so in this case, Y will only receive a true statement if Z1 or Z2 is true, or if X1 and X2 is true. Ultimately, that's how it maps back, right? Um, but not if they are both. So this is called an XOR rule, right? If X1 is true but not X2, Y is true. If X2 is true but not X1, Y is also true. But if X1 and X2 are both true, Y is false, right? Just a slightly more complex decision rule that we can get out of this now. I think that at this point, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and stop it here because video is long enough. We're also going to transition from this into more complex neural networks, and let's go ahead and save that for the next video, and I will see you in that next video.